Welcome, everybody. It's 2 o'clock, so we're going to go ahead and get started. My name is Stacy Matrazo. I'm the Executive Director of the Florida Wildflower Foundation. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar, Before They Were Native, A Brief History of Florida's Flora. For those of you not familiar with our organization, our mission is to protect, connect, and expand native wildflower habitats through education, research, planting, and conservation. Our work is made possible primarily through the sale and renewal of the Florida State Wildflower License Plate. This is our old look. Now you see our new look. Whether you have the old or new license plate, you are supporting us, and we thank you. Those funds, along with donations and memberships, allow us to support and create projects that build awareness and knowledge of native wildflowers and plants throughout Florida. We'd like to encourage those of you who find our programs valuable to consider becoming a member, making a donation, or purchasing the State Wildflower License Plate. And if you purchase or have the license plate, you are eligible for a membership with the foundation. Just let us know you have the tag and we'll get you set up in our database. Be sure to check our website for resources on planting and growing wildflowers, to learn where to see wildflowers in bloom, to find out about upcoming events and more. We're also on social media. You can find us on most platforms at FLA Wildflowers. Our next webinar will be on August 17th. Dr. Akito Kawahara, the Associate Curator with the McGuire Center for Lepidoptera, will introduce us to some amazing insects, moths. And in September, we have a program on Florida's carnivorous plants. Of course, we also have some great field trips coming up too. Next month, we are hosting a special members-only tour of Marie Selby Gardens in Sarasota. And that tour will focus on the native areas within the garden, including 2 native plant gardens funded by a grant from the Florida Wildflower Foundation. You can register for that on our website. Be sure to follow us on social media or subscribe to our newsletter to stay abreast of our webinar and field trip opportunities. I have just a couple of housekeeping items to go over before we get started. All attendees are muted with cameras off. We will be using the Q&A feature for questions. Yes, the chat is active, but we are not monitoring that for questions. So please use the Q&A if you have a question for James. We will address questions at the end of the talk as time permits. If your question is not answered, you're welcome to email it to us and we will forward that to James. We'll also include James's contact information in the resource sheet that we hand out. And finally, this webinar is being recorded. It will be available on our YouTube channel and on our website in about 24 to 48 hours. And again, we'll send a resource sheet out after in an email, and that will also include a link to rewatch the webinar or share it with your friends. And now, without further ado, I'd like to introduce our speaker. James Stevenson is an extension specialist with the University of Florida IFAS Extension in Pinellas County. He works at the Brooker Creek Preserve Environmental Education Center in Tarpon Springs and teaches classes on a variety of natural resource conservation topics, including plant identification, botany, entomology, ecology, and native plants such as ferns, wetland wildflowers, and epiphytes. James grew up in Clearwater and then went on to university in Tennessee and worked in botanic gardens in North Carolina before moving to the UK to work at the Royal Botanic Gardens, Kew, and the University of Oxford Botanic Gardens. And he's been with Pinellas Extension since 2006. I know you're really going to enjoy this, and without further ado, I will stop sharing my screen and hand it over to you, James.
Thank you, Stacy, and thank you very much for this opportunity to present to your group. This is very exciting. Welcome you all this afternoon. Thanks for spending your time with us this afternoon on this subject, before they were native, on the subject of native plants and the Florida Wildflower Foundation. Of course, we're all here because we love, admire, and appreciate our native flora. Enough with the introductions, though. Stacy did a great job. I am James Stevenson. I have been a botanist since I was very, very small and have appreciated the natural world, but in particular the plants. I tend to like working with plants a lot more than working with people. After growing up in Pinellas County, went to university in Tennessee, a very rich, diverse plant community there in the mixed mesophytic forest of the Cumberland Plateau in Sewanee, Tennessee. Then went on to the North Carolina Botanical Garden, where, if you're not familiar with the North Carolina Botanical Garden, you should be. It is a native plant botanical garden. The ethos there is conservation through propagation. So, conserving native plants and native plant communities through growing things. People love to possess, grow, own, control garden plants, and certainly promoting native plants in gardening is the North Carolina Botanical Gardens' main mission. My time at Kew Gardens led to the position at the University of Oxford Botanic Gardens, so quite a lot of experience, quite around the world with various plants from various regions of the world. And that led to, or it built upon an innate curiosity that I have had about nativity, and of course, all the issues that kind of surround native plants. Today's presentation, the description here in front of you, emboldened here is today's native plant communities, and no matter where you are in the world, this is true. The native plant communities, anywhere you go, are really just a snapshot over a vast amount of time of plant ecosystem development and demise through natural and artificial methods. And what we have as native plant communities today are, like I said, just that snapshot. So it begs the question, what does native mean to you? And part of the development of this presentation was to address just this. Not that there needs to be an answer that we all agree upon, but just ask yourself, what does native mean to you? We can borrow from groups that are particularly interested in the subject. The Florida Native Plant Society has this definition, which I took word for word from their website or from some of their promotional materials.
James, can I interrupt you? We're not
Certainly.
seeing your screen.
Oh,
I thought maybe you were just introducing and then sharing, but we're not seeing.
all right. Let me share. See if I can find my controls. Trying to find my Zoom control. Here we go. Share this. How is that?
Yes, now we are seeing that.
We got, what does native plant mean?
Yes,
Okay, great.
thank you.
Let's just make sure you didn't miss any good pictures. No, I really was just introducing self, subject, and asking the question in the first instance, what does native mean to you? And let's take a chapter from the Florida Native Plant Society. The Florida Native Plant Society has chosen a state boundary, which of course is an artificial construct, but it's the Florida Native Plant Society, so it has to start somewhere. So within the state boundary of the state of Florida as it exists today, prior to European contact. So native plants are plants and habitats that existed prior to European contact and prior to significant human impacts and alterations to the landscape. We'll take a look briefly later on at, was it just the Europeans that had an effect on native flora as far as people moving plants around? The U.S. Department of Agriculture has a slightly different take on this, and I currently work for government, and so I kind of get the way that the USDA is being here, very non-committal. And if we have a look at the USDA and their attempts at defining a native plant, well, they go ahead and admit it straight up front. It's difficult to define, and it's arbitrary in its circumscription. Talking about, again, prior to European contact, which is fair enough, major European contact, that is in the 15th century, talking about anything that is not native would have come from another part of the world that isn't North America. And prior to people, quote unquote, moving plants around for the thousands of years that we've been doing that. Again, with the caveat, it is often hard to know how a plant got where it is. And the USDA goes on to have these descriptions of nativity and going ahead and lumping everything from the lower 48 together. So anything from the lower 48, they call a native plant. Fair enough. Going on, they have further descriptors. Something can be considered native, probably native. Introduced, probably introduced. A waif, which is something that's left over from having been planted. Anyway, so you see how the USDA tries to wiggle around this kind of woolly subject to some of nativity. Interestingly, University of Florida has taken it a little bit more in a way that I quite appreciate. In a recent publication, UF has come up with terminology that we can all use when we're communicating native versus non-native, invasive, and all the issues that surround these. Using native and non-native and incorporating time into the equation. Because, as I mentioned before, native plant communities are a snapshot. And within our lifetimes, at least within our common recorded history, there have been enough changes that have seen the natural range expansion. The paper that this terminology comes from is here. If you, I believe I added this to a list of the references that you should be shared. Just a standardization of this terminology and introducing the concept of time, because range change is something that is quite possible, probable, actually inevitable when we're talking about species of plants and animals that might not recognize state boundaries and that sort of thing. Given time and given the natural processes, organisms can change their range based on many factors. Today, this is our beautiful state. And if you were to ask someone from out of the state to envision Florida flora, or imagine, if you will, plants in Florida, what do you think that person is going to close their eyes and envision? They're going to think coconut palms, right? This is the picture of Florida. This is everyone's picture of Florida. And it's certainly helped by popular culture, certainly helped by a lot of our tourist destinations that go to great lengths to create this kind of environment of the tropics, of the coconuts, of the tiki bars, and all this stuff. This is what people think of when they think Florida. This, as you all know, is the real Florida. Plant communities, habitats that are named for the dominant plant species, the oak hammock habitat, which once was 10% of our state flora, was comprised of the oak hammock habitat, really relegated to stream banks, wetter areas, very much not adapted to the fire. So really found in places where fire was excluded naturally. The pine flatwoods, on the other hand, was about 90% of the flora of peninsular Florida. Because, of course, fire was a natural, regular, predictable almost factor, and the plants that evolved in that site were adapted to these fires. Of course, the oak hammock and the pine flatwood, their abundance is flipped now in the absence of fire. Our wild natural areas are 90% oak hammock and 10% pine flatwood. Swamps, another native area, may be pictured in people's minds when you were to ask them what they've got. Flooded forest and all the adaptations of living in a flooded forest. One of my favorites, butt swell. You can see some of the hardwood trees in the background with the kind of expanded trunk bases. That's a condition called butt swell. Helps stabilize the trunk. A little bit bottom heavy, helps out in stabilization. Maybe some of us can relate. Anyway, the flooded forest, the cypress dome, another habitat named for the dominant vegetation of this spot. Of course, very much tied to a sinkhole type landscape. Sinkhole opens up, fills with water, populates with cypress, sometimes, and sets up this particular unique habitat. I, as Stacy mentioned, work at Brooker Creek Preserve. All the previous landscapes are found at Brooker Creek Preserve in Pinellas County, the most developed, the most densely populated county in the state. We're an urban county. We have these tiny little pockets of natural Florida. Brooker Creek, where I work, is one of these pockets. It's only 9,000 acres, which is huge for our itty-bitty county, but it is very small compared to other preserves around the state. We are freshwater wetland 50% and upland ecosystems. Our sister preserve, Weeden Island Preserve, encompasses a mangrove swamp, another landscape type named for the dominant vegetation, adapted in situ, complete with all the animals that and other plants that depend upon the mangrove swamp. This is the snapshot of our little county of Pinellas. Were there other landscape types that existed prior to the creation of this presentation? Yes. Have they been eliminated? Yes. There are others. There is sandhill and there is scrub habitat, which once existed in our little peninsula off of a peninsula, and they had their plant communities associated with those landscape types, but they didn't make it. They didn't make it through the development process, unfortunately. That's just a little look at what's going on in Pinellas County and a lot of Central Florida right now. So, what are the factors that influence these plant communities as they exist today? What factors are still at work allowing these precarious plant communities to hang on right now? a lot of abiotic factors, non-living factors, things like latitude. And latitude, generally speaking, is pretty stable. Our continents don't drift through the latitudes very rapidly, do they? Thankfully. And so there has been plenty of time for plant communities to become established and exist in latitudes. And of course, latitudes on Earth are going to dictate weather patterns, temperature regimes, and so on. Those temperature regimes, weather patterns, dictated or at least influenced by these latitudes, are going to help define plant communities. Our position within or being surrounded by all of this water certainly has a profound effect on temperature regulation, wind patterns, rain patterns, the sea breeze effect, of course, and all these things, another abiotic factor. If you've ever practiced horticulture, which I was a horticulturist practicing horticulture, which sounds kind of like witchcraft, I know, perhaps some of it is. Anyway, familiar with the cold hardiness map, the zone map, the cold hardiness zone map. Much more important in areas where there are more severe or less severe winters. You could choose to grow plants that were more adapted to withstand dreadful low temperatures. The cold hardiness zone does apply to peninsular Florida as well. And Florida is interesting in that the panhandle is considered to be in the temperate zone, characterized by cold winters, warm summers, deciduous trees, classic, what you would think of spring, summer, autumn, winter, autumn colors, white Christmas, all this stuff. Tropical Florida, on the other hand, in South Florida, the tropics are not characterized by that alternating hot and cold, but rather by a dry season and a wet season. So in the tropics, hot and cold is exchanged for wet and dry, and plants are adapted to withstand a dry season as the harsh season rather than the cold, dark season. And in Central Florida, where I am, and perhaps a lot of you, we're a little bit of both. We have characteristics of both. We can have a cool to cold winter and definitely a dry and a wet season. We're in our wet pattern right now, guaranteed afternoon thunderstorms every single day. So we are kind of in that overlap. As such, we have representative species that have adapted to the temperate zone. We have species that are adapted to the tropical zone. And for reasons that we will explore in not too long, plants have moved up and down the state and have established the species, not the individuals, the species have established themselves in the areas where they can hang on, survive, and reproduce. So we have those representatives in Central Florida that are also found in South Florida because they can. We have representative species in Central Florida that are also found in more northerly climates because they can hang on. So we have that wonderful overlap and diversity of species. This is the heat map, which is kind of a new construct. I believe I was still practicing horticulture when the heat zone maps were published, because heat can also be a limiting factor when it comes to what you want to grow. Now, this map was probably made in the late 90s. This map, I'm sure, needs to be redrawn. There is, I don't have to go into climate change. I don't have to go into global warming. It's irrefutable. It is, How we got here, if you want to argue, is fine, but we're here, and we are here in new heat zones. And as such, we will, in our lifetimes, and in our children's and in our grandchildren's lifetimes, we will see plants that are being forced to deal with heat as a limiting factor, much more than cold as a limiting factor. There's also soil regimes and soil, think about it, soil is not a permanent substance. It is an ephemeral. Soil can move. Soil is made of particles. Soil has an organic compound that can be added, subtracted, washed, rinsed, all these things. Soils establish themselves after long, long periods of time of the abiotic factors working upon them. So weathering of certain materials can lead to the formation of inorganic soils, decomposition leading to the creation of organic compounds in the soil, and so on. And finally, of course, the presence of fresh water. Freshwater, we're talking about land plants today. The presence, absence, distribution, depth of the watersheds, the water tables, and things like this. The drainage patterns. Drainage is always, can of course be a very limiting factor when you're talking about water availability. So we have these wonderful landscape types that are established here in Florida in various places. So how did we get here? Come on, James, get to it. We're here to find out how we got here, so let's get to it. Well, phase one, in the brief history of our dear planet, phase one, when we're talking about plant communities, would be the positioning of these these huge pieces, puzzle pieces that our planet is made of, and their loose association with one another on the surface of our big blue planet. The plates shift, slide, collide, subside, and so on. Here in the background are some names that are given to present day tectonic plates, big chunks of Earth crust that have and continue to shift around on the surface of our planet, moving continents to new latitudes, shifting continents into more northerly, more southerly, sending some continents underneath others. I mean, just crazy town. At the near the very beginning of all this shuffling, not we, because I'm not a geologist, I'm a botanist, they have identified this huge, more or less supercontinent called Gondwana. Not much life on land. Life was still very much in its early experimental phases in the oceans. Certainly exploding in diversity, but land wasn't quite on the menu yet. And all these things were stuck together. I want you to pay closest attention to the outlines of some possibly familiar continental shapes that were part of Gondwana here, South America, that I'm outlining here, Africa, that I'm outlining here. There's Australia beginning to take shape there, India there, and South Antarctica there. Florida is actually a part of Africa. So Florida needs to scooch all the way over here towards Laurentia, which will become North America, bringing all this African bedrock with it before it gets to be a part of what we now know as North America. This information from this paper, which is also available in your references, bit on Gondwana. Later, or during the Gondwanan, we had the first land plants begin to adapt to conditions on this uncharted territory. And plants, some modern representatives of those early examples of land plants exist in the true mosses, maintaining characteristics of aquatic plants. There's no vascular system, there's no plumbing. The mosses they didn't need it. They didn't know what it was, right? Because of course, original aquatic plants didn't need vascular systems. There was no need to move water around because you were surrounded by it. So these early land plants also lacked the vascular system. They had this wonderful single cell called a spore for reproduction, worked great in the water, made it work on land as well, and we began to see the progress of land plants in the form of the mosses and these things called liverworts, perhaps you've heard of. Eventually diversifying, vascularizing, developing plumbing so that water can be moved throughout, retaining those adaptations of the mosses, of waterproof surfaces, or at least desiccation proof, so that they don't dry out. They can exist on land. Here come the ferns. The ferns began to develop, be successful, colonize the land, and in so doing, biotic factors became more prevalent, more influential on the development of even more conditions that were conducive to even more plant diversity. The first soils begin to appear. Not just the mosses and the ferns, but a crazy group of organisms called lichen, part fungus, part algae, clinging to rocks. Some species being able to turn rocks into sand, into soil, and so on. So you see how things begin to be more conducive to a more diverse plant ecosystem. So they're already setting themselves up. So after the plants began colonizing the land, wasn't long that animals not wanting to be left out, couldn't help it, crawled their heavy bodies up out of the water. Those were pre-adapted with exoskeletons, so they wouldn't collapse. They weren't blobs, so they didn't collapse when they hauled themselves up on land. Those with exoskeletons found that they could spend more and more time out of the water, which led to some of these crustaceans, right? The arthropods, finessing, evolving into the insects. Insects and plants got on like house on fire. The plants made sugars that the insects could eat. The insects could move plants around, intentionally or not. With the arrival, of course, of flowering plants, the insects played a much, much larger role. But all these are happening after the plates had squished into this thing called Pangea. And this is around the time that Florida, our Florida, here you see, still being a part of Africa, is squished into this area called Laurentia that will become North America. A little bit more plate tectonics, a little bit more spinning around as the plates come and go and rip apart. In the meantime, plants are really starting to get a little full of themselves on land and getting big. There's now some pretty serious competition. It's not just a bunch of little tiny mosses having it out and vying for space in the sunlight. Plants are getting tall. They're taking full advantage of this vascular systems and an atmosphere rich in carbon dioxide, right? Allowing them to get larger and larger and larger. And we end up with some pretty massive land plants, also having to gain size and structure because we're getting some pretty big insects that are eating on those plants. And so it's constant battle back and forth. There was one group of plants called the lycopods that were some of the first tree-sized plants, huge biomass, lots of exposure to sunlight, lots of oxygen producing or oxygen releasing, I should say. And they're found very, very well represented in the fossil record, the lycopods, Lepidodendron and Sigillaria in particular. Today, that whole mega full of themselves group of plants are really only found in a few places. Some places you can find a whole lot of them, but really the lycopods have retired, for want of a better word. And they now just spend their time, they just spend their time at home in their garden, just taking it easy. No, they're not trying to change. They finished changing the world. They're taking a rest. And we can find lycopods like this Lycopodiella. This one's creeping around in a seasonally flooded area of our wetlands here, really just minding its own business, reproducing by spores, being a lycopod, being the kind of dead end of a ancient lineage of land plants. Others, the sphenopsids, like calamites, great big, dominant land plants on Pangea, taking over, releasing oxygen, making atmosphere, being fantastic, being great, are now also retired. And all we have left of that whole group of major plants are the horsetails, which you may or may not be familiar with, a type of fern that has silica in its cell walls called the scouring rush, ancient group. This one kind of gives a hint of what's coming next. You can see where the spores are produced in this structure called a strobolus. Strobe, like a strobe light, repeats. So this strobolus is a repeating little stack, little maybe spiral where the spores are produced. Can you see where we're going with this? Maybe you can. Next, here I go again. Next appears on scene these plants that reproduce using this wonderful invention that surpasses the spore in reproductive capacity, and it's called the seed. And that is an invention, if you will, a construct of a group of plants called the conifers. And some very, very early conifers, well represented again in the fossil record, leading us with the proliferation of the conifers and all these other very large land plants to the next phase of the development of plant ecosystems on land. If you want to learn more about pines of Pinellas, do check out our YouTube channel. This recording will be on the Florida Wildflower Foundation's YouTube channel. Pinellas County has its own myriad of topics, pines also. The ferns, of course, have been carrying on, diversifying, adding to not just the fossil record, but a very, very deep layer of organic matter. The ferns, of course, around today, we're all familiar with ferns. Just about everyone can identify a fern correctly, as a fern, I should say. Fascinating group of land plants and aquatics. Got to make a plug for Pinellas native ferns on our YouTube channel. What a horrible picture. During the Pennsylvanian period, The previous plant groups were extremely well represented and diverse in various habitat types. The climate was very warm and wet, so most everything was swamp. There were some higher areas where conditions might be slightly different, and there were nuances in the conifer flora, in the fern flora, but generally speaking, during this era called the Pennsylvanian, things are pretty warm and wet. It's kind of a swampy earth time. Look at the outline, however, of our Florida. Our Florida was not taking part in the development of a particularly rich and diverse plant community, or it's underwater is where I'm going with this. Florida sat out the Pennsylvanian underwater. It was warm. There wasn't a lot of ice locked up in ice caps or in South Poles or anything like that. It was just water. So Florida was snapped off of Africa, floated up north, hanging out in this latitude. All the ice melts. Florida's underwater, doesn't get to develop its own flora. It's having to wait during the Pennsylvanian. This is the time when all of that coniferous wood, all of those tree ferns, all of those lycopod trees, and the horsetail trees, those are all piling up on land. The bacteria, which have been around since there was life, and this surprises me, in fact, the bacteria had not caught up to this explosion and diversification of plants. Plants came along and really jump-started their diversification and their proliferation on land, but the bacteria wasn't along. The bacteria was not breaking down the wood, and the wood sat and piled up and got buried and buried and buried and buried because it wasn't breaking down. It wasn't decomposing. It wasn't turning back into soil. There were no decomposers. There weren't enough decomposers to deal with the mass of wood that was being produced. And we have what's known as the carbonate production. So all the coal, all the oil that we're burning now, all the sun energy that we're releasing from those underground plants, that was all happening during this carbon formation. Florida, meanwhile, was producing its own form of carbonates in the form of calcium carbonate. The area that Florida sits on found itself as a very shallow, clear marine system. And that shallow, clear marine system was perfect for the life such as the seashells, the mollusks that make shells, corals that can make limestone, basically. So the mollusks that can make limestone shells, the corals that can make limestone casts, the urchins, sand dollars, all these things were forming a huge area of undisturbed calcium carbonate, limestone, basically. So limestone is being laid down layer after layer after layer in this very calm, shallow sea for millions of years. North of the area that is Florida was a current called the Georgia Seaway, which was flowing from west to east, and all of this acidic wearing down of the granite rock that was the result of collisions that rose the Blue Ridge Appalachian Mountains squished all the rock, turned it into granite, made these acid-bearing rocks. And then as the acid-bearing rocks began to weather away, all that acid was leaking down towards the Georgia Seaway, but it was swept away from Florida. That acid would have laid waste to all of this wonderful calcium carbonate. All this wonderful limestone would have been just shot, dissolved, gone. So this Georgia Seaway helped keep all that acid away from the developing limestone rock formations that became the higher areas of Florida. And that Florida platform is primarily made of these carbonate deposits that are still around today. That limestone also led to the creation of the Floridan aquifer. Now, I'm not saying all the acid was excluded. It wasn't, of course, a perfect, and the limestone was eroded. This Floridan aquifer was and continues to be shot through with tubes and tunnels and holes and punctures, the result of acid working on that calcium carbonate and dissolving that calcium carbonate. So the fact that the Floridan aquifer, this limestone mass, this calcium carbonate mass, is like a sponge is due in large part to the activity of acid working on that calcium carbonate. Then, meanwhile, there's always a meanwhile. I mean, everything was happening everywhere. What happened, quote unquote, next, as we take these hundreds of millions of year steps through time, is that South America snapped off of Antarctica, Australia began to move northward, and a circular current developed that went round and round and round the South Pole, Antarctica. And that made cold. It made cold. I'm not going to tell you how because I can't, but it did. That event, the establishment of that circular current in the southern oceans, havoc for the rest of the planet. The Georgia Seaway filled in. Things are getting cold. Ice is getting locked up in the north and the south poles. It's lowering sea level so that now that wonderful acid blocker, that's hilarious, this acid blocker called the Suwannee Channel is disappearing because the ice is being locked up in the north and south pole. Sea level is lowering. That platform becomes the boundaries of the entire area that is Florida. And add to that, now we have the northern movement of materials. We have sand. We have the weathering products of rain and wind on the Appalachian Mountains can now come south. There is now land that connects this Florida platform to the rest of North America. And here comes the sand. Here comes the sand, which is phase 3. Sandblasting, the sandblasting of Florida. So coming from the north, all this weathering material being acidic, of course, because it's part of this granite stone. Also, the quartz, sand, and things like this. Global changes in temperatures mean more ice is locked up in the North and South Pole, making the coast 100 miles further out than it is now, and also during times between glaciations of a very high sea level, leaving only the central spine of Florida exposed. Here's during the last interglacial, the coastline of Florida looked something like this. So the rest of the areas that are shaded in darker blue, again, are being excluded locally from the establishment and proliferation of particular plant communities, land plant communities, because they're underwater. The sand ridges, a product of this movement of sand from the north, and the action of wind and the action of that rising sea level pushing sand towards the center of the state as the sea rose from each direction and the coastline moved further and further towards the middle. We ended up with these wonderful ridges that we still know today. The ridge system in central Florida. So all this material coming from the north, what else besides sand do you think is traveling now that there's land? In addition to all that soil and all those deposits that are being blown on the wind, washing down through riverine systems, in addition to all that, of course, we're getting animals, and animals have in their guts the propagules of the plants that they were grazing on up north. The plants themselves taking advantage of the whatever distribution mechanism they have. Sand spurs hitching a ride on hooves, milkweed seeds floating on the wind. Now there's actual dry land, and all the propagules are now have access to this southern peninsula that was formerly blocked off. Mind you, sea level is continuing to rise and fall, and these species are continuing to exist and get flooded and then repopulate and get flooded again. But during this phase, the eastern coastal plain flora was established. And that is pretty much a uniform flora throughout the southeast. Abiotic factors, including rainfall amounts, lightning, fire is a very major component of the health and establishment and continuation of the coastal plain flora. Florida got to be a part of that coastal plain flora that still exists today. We have some pretty cool data from a very, 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 probably one of the oldest Florida artifacts from the oldest part of time when Florida was where it is today, a 60,000-year-old lake. On the Lake Rails Ridge, because this is a part that never got completely erased, or at least not for very long, so continued to be a repository of airborne artifacts, sediments for 60,000 years, which isn't a really long time, but it is for Florida. So core samples of this extremely old area can give us a hint of what was growing during these interglacial periods. And not surprisingly, lots and lots of pine trees. Now, number one, it's easy to determine that pines were there because pine pollen is an airborne structure. Pines, as you know, produce an awful lot of pollen. They're wind pollinated, so clouds of pollen are produced, so very easily collected as sediment in this lake. Male and female cones of the pines, the male cones are the ones that produce the pollen. We don't have to go into all that. The pines, based on the pollen that has been collected from Lake Tulane, include our favorites that are still around today. Slash pine pollen was found in those deposits, longleaf pine found in those deposits, and even sand pine. Sand pine, Kathleen Parker makes an argument that sand pine is an endemic It can be called a forever endemic Florida plant, except for maybe just a little tiny bit that shows up in Alabama, but sand pine, Pinus clausa, present based on pollen deposits in this ancient lake. Very, very hot conditions, very, very dry conditions, interspersed with lightning events, led to the proliferation of oaks. Oaks also use wind to pollinate. So vast quantities of oak pollen can be detected as a lot was laid down in these deposits over time. Wind finds the female flowers, the development of acorns, the establishment of those animals that depend on the acorns for their survival, and ecosystem is born as the climatic conditions allow. And of course, the oak species found primarily live oak, ancient oaks. And the oaks in Florida diversified, the species that we both borrowed from the north as plants found their way southward, sometimes racing ahead of glaciers. Also some that have speciated or come into being uniquely in Florida. The oaks prefer a drier climate than the pines. Pines like it a little bit wetter. Oaks tend to hybridize, being those wind-pollinated flowering plants. Cross-pollination is much more likely, and hybrids can still be found today in our woods. And oaks are often associated with grasslands. Here we go again. Grasses, wind-pollinated, plenty of grass pollen found in those deposits from 60,000 years. You know what else is wind-pollinated? Ragweed. Yeah, it's a native plant. Wind-pollinated, doesn't make showy flowers. A lot of wind-pollinated plants have armoring on their pollen so that when they do find the sticky stigma of their own species, they can grab onto that stigma. Guess what else they can grab onto? The inside of your nose. So that's why ragweed can be such a annoying thing. Plants with I don't know why I'm having to say this, but plants with showy flowers generally don't produce pollen that's going to prove annoying to your nasal passages, because that pollen is supposed to stick to something that's in the flower. So unless you have your nose, unless you put the pollen in your nose, you're very unlikely to come into contact with pollen from plants with showy petals. Moving on. Now we have people. 11,000 years ago, ecosystems are set up. Oak hammocks in the areas that are absent of fire, pine flatwoods in those regularly burned areas, hardwood swamps, mangrove swamps, basically what we have today. Sand hills, we can be a little bit more nuanced, scrub areas, sand hills, and then there's people. And this time is referred to as a time of the Holocene. More recently, there has been suggestions that we rename at least the end of the Holocene, when people really started messing with things, the Anthropocene, because of the huge impacts of human activities on the world. A opinion piece that appeared in the Journal of Biogeography raises the question of where do people fit in to the establishment of, the maintenance of, the changing of plant communities? When and where, or if, do people, humans, become one of the biotic factors one of the living influences that can be considered natural. The expansion, natural, of the coyote has had a direct impact on the movement of certain plant propagules. So the coyote, are we going to consider the coyote a natural vector and a co-conspirator in the expanding range of a particular plant species? Are we going to allow that? Are we then going to allow the movement and activities of humans? And when do we draw the line? When do we stop? All these questions are questions. This is just I don't have an answer. Maybe you have an answer. I don't have an answer. This is just for you to think about. But let's take a look. Let's finish up, because I know a lot of these lectures are pretty pictures, pretty plants. That's what we're here for. Let's finish up with some pretty plants. How are we doing on time? I'm keeping you a little bit longer than I anticipated, and I apologize for that. Now we will get to some pretty pictures of pretty plants. Endemics. That means these are the plants that once their ancestor arrived in Florida, those ancestors took a hold, and then further generations of that species morphed into, over time, new species, more perfectly adapted to the conditions of peninsular Florida than the ancestors were. These species include things like the Florida milkweed, a little diminutive, adorable sandhill milkweed. Here you can see the size if you're familiar with the hair-streaked butterflies, small flowered milkweed. Florida green eyes, Berlandiera, one of the little sunflowers, again, better suited as a species to life in the outrageous conditions that peninsular Florida was going through, with the sea level rise and fall and rise and fall and rise and fall and fire and, flooding and then lightning and all these things. Here we have the endemic species that survived all that toing and froing that led to our native plant communities now. Cuthbertia, formerly Calicia, the little roseling, you can see it's a member of the Tradescantia group of plants, the family Commelinaceae. If you grow spiderwort, you might see the family resemblance there. Several of the ironweed relatives, those composites or sunflower groups that are like little thistles, little miniature thistles on sprays, the Carphephorus, the chaffheads, Indian paintbrush, lots of common names for this group. Odoratissimus variety subtropicanus, uniquely adapted and endemic to peninsular Florida. Did you know that there are two centrosemas? Did you care? One is endemic. The other can be found throughout the coastal plain flora. The difference in our endemic species are the calyx, the sepals are smaller. I mean, it could matter if you have this endemic within your sphere of influence. You can be very proud that it's there. It's an endemic. Of course, the rosemaries get a lot of attention and a lot of love because they're called rosemary, even though they're not. Who knows? These might be changed to the genus Salvia, just like culinary rosemary has in very recent history. Anyway, the scrub rosemaries, grandiflora is a native Florida Lake Wales Ridge endemic. The Florida tick seed, everyone get the license plate. It's beautiful. Support your native plant foundation, please. And interestingly, Elysium, the anise tree. Yes, it's where we get, not this isn't where we get, but this genus is the source of culinary star anise, This genus, Elysium, is found in Asia and Southeast US. This one species is only found in Florida. But after all of that toing and froing and heaving and hoeing and sea level rise and plate tectonics and all this stuff, Elysium is a living member of an ancient lineage of flowering plants. So early flowering plants included very close ancestors of the anise tree. So the anise tree flowers are put together like some of the very earliest experiments in floral morphology. And a little oak, little scrub oak, perhaps an original hybrid that had mutations that made this oak more suited to the toing and froing of the abiotic factors that our flora was subjected to, that led to this snapshot that we are surrounded by at this very moment. Little Quercus aenaopina, one of the scrub pines. I've kept you longer than I anticipated. I apologize for that. That's enough. That's 500 million years in an afternoon. Time for me to get a drink of water. I'm sure it's time for you. This is just the tip of the iceberg. This is a botanist giving you this overview. There's tons more to learn, and there's lots of ways to learn. And we do hope that you'll take advantage of all the recordings that the Florida Wildflower Foundation has to offer. We too, at Pinellas County Extension, have a vast library of recorded webinars and other presentations on particular groups of plants, particular plant adaptations, that sort of thing. So hopefully you'll tune in. We still have a long, hot summer in front of us, so lots of fun indoor activities. If you're interested in podcasting, check out the UF IFAS Naturally Florida podcast. The most recent episode was all about the issue of rat poison. We had a terrible spate of dead owls that were poisoned indirectly by eating rats that had been fed rat poison. So what do? That's the most recent episode of Naturally Florida podcast. Come visit us at Brooker Creek Preserve, Tarpon Springs, Florida. Come and see natural Florida as it is. And now I will stop talking and I will happily, or I will take some questions. Let's see what we have in Q&A. More in the future. Okay, yes. Well, thank you very much for your feedback. We always appreciate any feedback. There's only one way to make things better, and that's to find out what we did really poorly, I suppose. No, there's other ways of making things better. Any other Q's and A's? Thank you very much. Ooh.
I think we're just getting lots of positive comments and no questions. I think it's a lot of information to take in, but perhaps you'll come back and do the next 150,000 years and tell us what happened.
My pleasure.
We will include all of the links that are in the that Emily has been putting in the chat. So the Pinellas County YouTube channel will include a link to Brooker Creek, all the information that James has shared with us today, as well as references to many of the articles that he has cited in the presentation too. So look for that in the next couple of days. We'll get that out to you via email. And I do want to just remind everyone that if you enjoyed this program and enjoy the work that the foundation is doing, please consider becoming a donor, a member, or getting the state wildflower license plate, because we need your support. And with that, I will say thank you to James. Thank you so much for giving us your time in this amazing lecture today. And yeah, thank you. Bye, everyone.